How long do you want me to talk for?
Maybe half an hour.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Something like that.
Okay, right.
So we could have discussion afterwards if you feel like it.
Yes. Oh, I hope so, yes.
Okay, dobar dan, želim svima, dobrodošli na predavanje profesorke Jo Shaw koja nam dolazi sa univerziteta u Edinburghu. Pošto će predavanje biti na engleskom, ja bih htjela samo par uvodnih reči da kažem na engleskom. So, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Jo Shaw from the University of Edinburgh. And some of you may remember her from 2 years ago when she participated in a conference in Europe we organized here at our institute. Jo Shaw is professor at School of Law at the University of Edinburgh, where she also holds the Salveson Chair of European Institutions, and she's the Dean of Research and Deputy Head of the College of Humanities and Social Science. Now, Jo's professional biography is very rich, and I will not go into details of it today, and some of it you've read in the announcement we sent you. But I will stress that Jo currently runs 2 major projects on citizenship, and one of them is a large European Research Council-funded project on the Europeanization of citizenship in the successor states of the former Yugoslavia, aka SITSI. So she's been focusing recently in the region, especially from the perspective of the changing citizenship regimes in the post-Yugoslav states. And today we will listen to the presentation entitled The Contested Spaces of Citizenship. So, Jo, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, Jelena and colleagues, to come and talk to this institute. I very much enjoyed my previous visit to this institute to speak at a conference on Europe and theory and identity and many other interesting things. It was a very rich conference back in 2010, and it's great to come back here today to speak to you about essentially some work in progress that I'm using to underpin my thinking for the second phase of the SITSI project. And although I know many of you know a lot about SITSI, some possibly more than I do, like Igor Stix, who's here today as well with me, who works on the SITSI project, and other colleagues who've worked or are working on it, then just forgive me if I just lay out a few sort of preliminary ground points about it, and then explain a little bit about what I'm going to try and do in this short paper, which is focused around the somewhat cryptic diagram that you've got above my head, and also Jelena's kindly printed out. And as I said, this is work in progress, so I'm really going to appreciate your comments on this and your thoughts on this. So SITSI is a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council, and that's given us enough time and space and resource to not only map and describe and analyse and interpret the citizenship regimes of the new states of southeastern Europe, and for these purposes we've taken all of those polities which have citizenship regimes, obviously including Kosovo as well, and we've, with the help of researchers such as Jelena, who did a lot of work on Serbia, we've presented those materials on the SITSI website, both in, as it were, serious academic form, but also we've presented them in a more magazine-like web format, the so-called web magazine sitsi.eu, which Citizenship in Southeast Europe, for which Igor is the sort of managing editor, I suppose, and the conceiver and the father and everything of this project within SITSI. And then we're moving on to a second phase where we're going beyond mapping and describing the regimes, if you will, not seen completely in isolation. We've looked at many of the relations and tensions. Citizenship is essentially a relational concept. You cannot consider it simply in isolation. Citizenship regimes are never black boxes. But what we're trying to do in the second phase of the project is to compare compare those citizenship regimes across relevant criteria. Now, many of the people who are working within CITSE come from what one might call a broad political science framework, and are schooled and trained in the methodologies of political science, which is well and fine and very, very useful for comparing aspects of citizenship regimes. For example, looking at ethnic citizenship, such as Marko Zilovic is doing at present for CITSE, and other researchers, Dejan Stepanovic, is looking at territorial differentiation, territorial subnational units, territorial politics of citizenship, and other colleagues are looking at diaspora questions, education policy, the representation of citizenship in the media, and other issues. And we've got another phase of research that will start later on in 2012. It will be the final phase of substantive research. So, but in that context, my role is, as it were, as a manager and as a supervisor and a support for the research of others. But I'm also struggling as a researcher myself to find satisfactory frameworks of analysis which will be useful for me to present my, as it were, final outcomes from the project. So some of those final outcomes from the project will be both Igor's alone. He's worked a lot on citizenship in Southeast Europe. The individual researchers, some collective works, some joint works, and of course I'm also trying to produce something worthwhile. Whether I manage it or not is another matter. And this is where the work in progress comes, and this is where hopefully you might be able to help me. And that's very selfish of me. Crowdsourcing one's research, I always think it's a really good idea. So I'm curious as to why legal studies of citizenship are essentially quite narrow. You know, you can read in almost any book about citizenship. You can read a political perspective. You can read a sociological perspective. You can read what anthropologists and ethnographers have got to say about it. Geographers want us to concentrate on space, the territorial dimension perhaps. Historians point out that citizenship is located in time as well. Economists might want us to think about citizenship as a tradable market good, as well as some sort of public good as well, a status good. But citizenship remains often a sort of black box. It's often invoked, but rarely unpacked and examined in its component parts. And I think that the greatest scholarly neglect really is in relation to legal scholarship. Now, there is obviously a lot of substantive work on citizenship and law, which invokes, for example, the legal bond. It looks at the status of the citizen under the constitutional framework. It looks at citizenship both as membership within constitutional frameworks. It looks at citizenship as nationality, as it's recognized in international law, both public international law and also private international law. And in addition to that, law has quite a lot to say both about the detailed regulation of access to citizenship. So citizenship laws, which we've studied a lot in the CITSE project. We've studied how people become citizens of Serbia or citizens of Croatia, or indeed how people cease to be citizens of Croatia or of Serbia. And we've studied whether or not those systems allow dual citizenship and how they interact with each other. We've studied the relationship between citizenship law and territory. And to a certain extent, we've taken it a little bit further, and we're doing that more in the second phase of the research, also to look at some of the ways in which law intervenes to support some of citizenship's rights and obligations. In particular, for example, political rights of citizenship, and how does law regulate these? What role do legal regulations have to do in them, to do with this? Now, those are the two main focuses, in my view, about for citizenship, the relationship between citizenship law. And I think it's somewhat inadequate as an intellectual framework for study. And since I know I'm basically speaking to a group of non-lawyers here with few exceptions, I'm sure you will agree with me it's an inadequate framework. You don't want to listen to a narrow normative or doctrinal recitation of citizenship laws and citizenship rights, but nonetheless you're probably open to the suggestion that perhaps legal scholarship can take a different view, a wider view about the relationship between citizenship and law. Now let's put it in a different way. Citizenship is very often reduced to a three-way division, a triptych, if you will. Some people call it, citizenship has a status element, a rights element, and an identity element. Or some other people might say that citizenship has a rights element, an access element, and a belonging element. The three-part lists are very symbolically satisfying as well as potentially intellectually satisfying. And all of these seem to suggest, and based on what I've just said about citizenship and law, that law is likely to have most to say about status and rights, and very little to say about identity or belonging. Or to adapt and to apply in a certain way Habermas's conception of a double coding of citizenship, marrying together the role of the state and the nation, if you will, that law is perhaps sometimes seen as confined merely to the formal realm of the legal status itself, or the civil and political and social rights conferred by the state or non-state entities. But I would argue that in addition, law can be seen as contributing to the informal and ideational roles of citizenship in binding together different sorts of culturally defined communities. This is important, I think, because identity often has an institutional as well as an ideational dimension. It's widely accepted in citizenship scholarship that it brings together, or it develops, it shows a set of so-called institutionally embedded social practices. And in this context, the work of Polanyi has been quite influential on certain citizenship scholars, and I would adapt and apply the approach of a Canadian social theorist in this context, Margaret Summers, or theorist of citizenship, when she goes on to define citizenship as an instituted process. I think this is a very useful formulation for those who want to look at and take very seriously the role of law in this context, but not to be reduced to simply, if you will, normative and doctrinal precepts about the role of law in relation to citizenship. I've developed this point at some length, which clearly I cannot present. I've prepared about a 35-page paper, which nonetheless is so extraordinarily fragmentary and cobbled together that it can only be given to my most trusted associates. And we had a very interesting discussion in Edinburgh at the beginning of February, when we were really pleased that Jelena and a number of other colleagues who've worked in CITSI were able to come back and join those of us who are currently working there. And we had a great discussion about my fragmentary work in progress, but that was done on the basis that everyone read it in advance and then they took it apart. But I'm trying to approach it slightly differently today. So having made those preliminary comments about citizenship and the need for something that goes beyond, if you will, a doctrinal approach. Now let me think about some of the building blocks that we already have to try to give meaning to the role of citizenship, the role of law in relation to citizenship, and to work out what more can be said. Now, this approach doesn't, as it were, come out of nowhere. I've played around for some time, and more recently also in the work that I've been doing with Igor and an introduction that we've written together to a volume on citizenship, or a special issue of Citizenship Studies, and there could be an edited collection as well. We've been playing around with concepts of citizenship regimes. Now, there's nothing especially novel about the notion of citizenship regimes, and those who've done gender studies, for example, will be familiar with the concept of gender regime that's been developed by colleagues such as Sylvia Walby to describe the ensemble of different practices and institutions which maintain gender relations within and across polities. And likewise, the concept of regime is very familiar from an international relations context to understand. Stephen Krasner, I think, is perhaps very closely associated with the concept of regime in the international context, to think about ensembles of institutions and rules which regulate sets of relations. And here we're talking about citizenship relations. And I think that what's interesting for me is that the regime concept already provides an access point for inquiry into these institutions and rules. And so what we're doing then is using this concept of citizenship regime to build a framework for studying law which goes beyond a doctrinal approach. We're not simply studying the texts of laws and interpreting them in terms of their applicability to particular fact situations. We're also looking then for ways in which we can understand how law changes, how law evolves, what is its relationship with politics. Self-evidently, citizenship must have a politics. It's about power. But let's think then constructively about what that concept is. What that relationship is. And let's not in that context simply rely on theories of politics. So theories of politics that interpret political behaviour as either about self-interested maximalisation of individuals, or that simply constructs it in terms of the interests of states. The interactions between states. If we're going to take law seriously in that context, we also have to look at an individual behaviour dimension. Law is also about strategic behaviour. It's about how individuals use opportunities, shape opportunities, and interact with institutions. Individuals are not passive actors within the framework of citizenship regimes. They're also actors themselves who shape the opportunities, the legal opportunity structures, if you will, that give them an opportunity to make claims, to have those claims rejected, to redevelop those claims perhaps in another context, changing forum, stopping focusing on the domestic and looking at the European or the international instead. So finding law in another place as well as finding law in the domestic domain. So the citizenship regime concept, I think, offers something that's very useful, and it offers a way of encompassing not just the formal rules and regulations and administrative practices which govern formal citizenship status. It also allows us to encompass different types of status which are close to citizenship, so quasi-citizenship. And it allows us to see citizenship and non-citizenship in the same domain. We're not just simply focusing on the presence of citizenship, we can also focus on its absence. And it allows us also to bring in these ideational characteristics as well, the informal ideologies, narratives, beliefs and practices which are often just as important as the formal legal rules. So we see this contestation about who belongs and why, both internally and externally. And we can see this both in these regimes, the citizenship regimes of the new states of Southeast Europe. But my contention is, and this is why, of course, it's very interesting, in particular, I think, for me in particular, and I hope for other people, is that this is not just this is not just about thinking about citizenship in Southeast Europe. This is also thinking about, for me, a more satisfactory conceptualization which has potential general application for the study of citizenship regimes, and potentially general application for thinking about how we compare citizenship regimes within a multi-level governance world, a world of multi-level governance systems where there are multiple sites of authority and sites of power. And there's not just the states, there are also the interactions between the states. There's the subnational level of governance, which is quite important. It's particularly important in my country, in the United Kingdom, with devolution and the potential implications of devolution for citizenship in Scotland, where I live, but also, obviously, and this is where I come from intellectually, as it were, at the European Union level, and also at the level of the European Convention on Human Rights, the norms of which can have an impact upon citizenship regimes. Now, you might say, well, then why don't you just stick with citizenship regimes? What's the need for some other conceptualization? Why do you need this idea of a space? Why do you need something like that? Well, and indeed I was asked that on several occasions at this event in February in Edinburgh. Why bother with the concept of a space? It's just, or indeed as a space of law, citizenship as a space of law. You're just inventing another metaphor just for the sake of it. You are just trying to occupy the intellectual terrain, surely? No, of course not. Academics never try to occupy intellectual terrain or establish their own brand, which others would have to adopt or deny, or reject. Well, my contention is that there is something in this approach. There is something in this approach that can also make it useful not just for thinking about citizenship as a space of law, but citizenship as a space of politics. And perhaps when we come to the second phase of this symposium, as it were, or this seminar, where we'll have some question and answer, then others might comment about what the potential of citizenship as a space, studying citizenship as a space of law is, and the way in which we can also get interactions with other groups of academics who've not been so directly involved in CITSE. CITSE is very much an interdisciplinary project. As a lawyer, I'm a minority, an endangered minority, I might say. And we've mainly been various different groups of political scientists and anthropologists, people who are uncategorizable, but also but mainly people from the field, I suppose, of political science in its various variants, and that's a very rich field in itself. But in thinking about citizenship, in inevitably thinking about, well, we're not just about explaining what's happened in the former Yugoslavia and the tragedies and the traumas and so on. We're also thinking about, we're intellectuals, we're trying to establish our own domains of study for the longer term. We also want to interact with other types of scholars of urban space, geographers, architects, people who look at contemporary visual dimensions, who can offer us other ways of understanding other aspects of citizenship that are highly pertinent in today's world. Some types of contestation of citizenship and the link to activism and so on and so forth. In those contexts, the broad concept of space can be a very useful one. But more than that, and say it's not just about trying to establish the intellectual terrain. I think there is something genuinely quite interesting about trying to map a space of law by using a series of tensions, which I've identified on that diagram, which I'm going to talk a little bit now and then bring what I've got to say to a conclusion, so everyone can see what we've got there. Our main discussion in February focused on whether or not citizenship as a space of law should go around the outside rather than be this this disembodied bit in the middle across which the tensions operate. And I'm inclined to think that those who suggested that it would be better to put that around the outside than to have it in the middle are correct. But unfortunately, I've not had a chance to rewrite that and rethink it in that way. So if that was the question that you were going to ask, why don't you put the box around the outside? Sorry, it's been asked and it's been answered, and it does have certain interest to it. And in a way then, of course, it would make it plainer than it is at the moment because of this box where the lines break. It would make it plainer than it is at the moment that these are, if you will, pairs of concepts primarily that I've tried to put together. Now, let me just explain how this grew up, how this reconceptualization of citizenship as a space of law grew up. It grew up primarily by thinking, starting thinking about the vertical and the horizontal dimension on that, or the horizontal and vertical axes on that piece of paper that you've got there. That is the focus on. Because I started thinking, when I started thinking about citizenship in Southeast Europe, because this has grown out of thinking about citizenship in Southeast Europe in particular. I know much more about citizenship in the former Yugoslavia than I do about citizenship in Britain. Absolutely nothing about citizenship in Britain. It grew out of thinking about the concept of Europeanization, which is in the title of the project, and I was. Having included the title Europeanization in the project, I was actually very unhappy with that concept. It's not a concept that I'm particularly comfortable with. I don't find it has a lot of analytical rigor. And so I was trying to think of other ways of talking about some of the same things that people talk about when they talk about Europeanization, but in ways which were more meaningful for me, coming from a background in EU law, not in EU politics. So I started off by thinking about the relationship between external constraints and norms that impose themselves on or have an effect on citizenship, and then the internally generated constraints and norms. So obviously, in a way, you might say that citizenship laws adopted by parliaments are internal constraints and norms of citizenship regimes. But equally, we see in Southeast Europe, and then if we actually look at most states, we see increasingly that external constraints and norms have an impact upon citizenship regimes. So principles such as non-discrimination on grounds of race or ethnicity are important constraints and norms that impose themselves on citizenship regimes and may be embedded in a domestic constitutional context, but may also be found in provisions such as the European Convention on Human Rights, in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and in other areas of international law that have an impact upon citizenship regimes domestically. And if we just look at the EU itself, the EU's own free movement regime increasingly has an impact upon citizenship. And that may be free movement looked at from the perspective of freedom to travel from an outside EU, inside Schengen visa liberalisation, where we've seen that plenty of examples of citizenship, EU rules having an impact on the citizenship regimes within those states. But it also has an impact once a state is a member of the EU because of certain rules and constraints and that are provided in relation to both access to citizenship and the potential of loss of citizenship as well. And there's a whole body of law that I could talk about if anybody were interested in it about EU law and national citizenship regimes. Now, this is all the case despite the fact that the mantra, the headline is citizenship regimes are determined by sovereign, their sovereign state determination. There are areas where states can make a choice, and each state can make its own choice about how its citizenship regime is modelled and how it operates. In reality, the story is much more complicated than that. And that's why I thought that the first constitutive tension within citizenship as a space of law is the relationship between the exogenous dimension of, say, international and European law and the endogenous dimension of domestic rules. But in the Southeast Europe context, we can also talk about the relationships between different pairs of states as well, or groups of states, because of the impact of the regime of the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia as well. But I can talk about all of that in detail if you want me to. Now, the second constitutive space of law that I found, but which is why it's still on the horizontal dimension, just because these were the areas I was thinking about at the time. I'm not trying to offer this as a final categorization. This is a stream of consciousness. This is as I found them bit by bit, and how I developed this project, if you will. And that was the role of the rule of law in this context. And this was not something I would have ever thought about in relation to citizenship until I studied it in the context of the former Yugoslavia, to think about what the role of the rule of law is, to try to unpick that. You might say, it's really obvious, rule of law, it's not something you would worry about. We live in Western liberal type states, so we don't need to worry about the rule of law. But in fact, of course, the rule of law is very contested, and it's very contested not just in the former Yugoslavia, where there have been so many attempts to export this rule of law into these states in transition, but it's actually, when you look below the surface, under the surface, the rule of law is very contested in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, in all sorts of EU states, the role of the rule of law, and how we conceive the rule of law. What is the rule of law? Is it simply a simple, thin procedural guarantee? Or is the rule of law something thicker? Does it instantiate some values as well? So those were my first two thoughts, and as I say, that's why they got priority in being put on the vertical and the horizontal dimension. They are still there, aren't they? Yeah, good. They haven't changed. And this, as I say, this is a sort of just a sort of stream of consciousness set of ideas. And then I started to think about all of the other different elements that are in tension within citizenship, which demand a detailed analysis of how institutions and laws and legal regulations operate. And these are perhaps less obviously unpicked. I think very closely related to the conception of the rule of law would be this tension between citizenship as a mere legal status and citizenship as community bond, this Habermasian double coding of citizenship, which I now recall that I wrote about sometime in the mid-1990s, but had completely forgotten that I'd written about it until we started talking about it with one of our colleagues in the CITSI project. It's ridiculous, isn't it? I've been doing academic work for so long, I can now do the same work for a second time with no memory of having done it. Don't laugh, you'll be like that soon enough. When I forget people, he looks at me with a sort of, of course you remember them. No, I don't. I genuinely don't remember people, And now I've been doing work for so long, I can have the pleasure of rediscovering Habermas, having actually read him about 15 years ago on citizenship, and it's like a completely new story. Oh, that's really interesting. I wish somebody had told me that Habermas had written about citizenship. Well, you read it 15 years ago and wrote about it, you stupid woman. Anyway, there we go. These are the pleasures when you've been an academic for as long as I have, that you can do it again with a sense of novelty. So there we go. That's another tension, I think, that helps us to understand citizenship as a space of law. And I said something about that at the beginning as well, so I won't say very much more. An issue that arises in the UK and arises also very much in the former Yugoslavia is the tension between territorial uniformity. Is citizenship do we prioritise the citizenship of the state and solely the citizenship of the state, or do we think about citizenship also within territorial units as well, within the state? And this is very pertinent in the EU, in the UK, and it's of course by definition pertinent in the EU, which offers its own type of quasi-federal European Union citizenship, but which is territorially differentiated by reference to the access points to citizenship that is offered by national citizenship as defining EU citizenship. So I think that's incredibly important, and I think that law and the role of law and the role of legal actors and the claims that are made in that context are very, very important. And then two things which I think are quite closely related. One is the public-private divide, which is sort of diagonally across there, and then very closely related to that, the relationship between top-down and bottom-up processes. Yeah, we've come into citizenship thinking about it in a rather top-down way, but actually citizenship is a very bottom-up concept, not just because it's about individuals' lived experiences and their ways of negotiating through that, but in terms of how law operates within citizenship, the capacity to construct yourself as someone who can make a particular claim or can't make a claim and therefore has to look somewhere else, has to look to Europe, for example, as people always say. I'm looking to Europe, going to Europe. Very much part of the language of non-governmental organisations. In that case also, the relationship between the public and private and the bottom-up, top-down are two very closely interrelated tensions within citizenship as a space of law. Now, I'm not suggesting that those 6 tensions in any way completely map or describe or help to interpret citizenship as a space of law. But inferentially, as a legal scholar who is not sympathetic to a positivist and doctrinal approach as being the be-all and end-all of what law can tell us, inferentially they suggest to me that there's much material that can be studied here. Much material both specifically related to Southeast Europe, but potentially also for many other spaces of citizenship that we can look at, both in the current European Union and perhaps in some of the other places that the EU has an impact upon, for example, in the Caucasus, for example, or in Central Asia, where there is an impact of the EU through its neighbourhood policies on citizenship regimes. Okay, so that's really where I am at the moment. There's a lot of there's a lot of notes and examples being built and so on and so forth. But I think we reached the conclusion when we were talking about this in Edinburgh in February that really this is the prospectus for a book, possibly even a big book, and it's not really a small paper that can be presented in all of its elements in about half an hour or 45 minutes. But what I want to do is just sort of revise and review it by providing you, perhaps even just literally reading out to you my conclusion or my in lieu of a conclusion. And what I'm trying to do is to scope out a framework for the effective comparison of citizenship regimes in the new states of Southeast Europe. I'm locating myself within the broad framework of comparative constitutional law, but I'm also informed in that context by insights from comparative citizenship studies, which is a whole field of research that is reviewed in this paper, and which we've talked about quite a lot in CITSI, and also I'm informed by my broader studies of European Union law, European integration, my understanding of that, which is the element that I come with. And my approach is to provide not just a sort of, is not to provide a single answer to the question, what are the regimes in these new states? What are the citizenship regimes? But rather what I'm trying to do is to map a space within which they're continuously contested in a manner that can usefully be understood as engaging questions of law and normative order. What I think this approach offers is to reinforce the argument for the utility of a citizenship approach to understanding some of the problems of the new states of Southeast Europe. And I think that's obviously a pertinent conclusion to bring out in the context of this group here in this room now. It's been our argument within CITSE that this region has been and provides a good example of the continuing relevance of the Arendtian insight of the centrality of the right to have rights and the primacy of citizenship over human rights. As many people have argued, Arendt shows us that when a person is expelled from the polity, she is in effect expelled from humanity, and thus without citizenship rights there can be no realization of human rights. And there I'm quoting from Margaret Summers and her collaborator, someone called Roberts, whose first name I can't remember off the top of my head. And in that sense, my paper and CITSE's research as a whole presses the case for the starting point as a focus on citizenship as legal status. But as I said in this paper, law has traditionally had a rather constrained role in helping us to understand the concept of citizenship, which stretches beyond the legal core of membership. That is, who is a member of a given polity and what legal rights and obligations do they have. I argue in my paper and in my research that looking at citizenship nested in the midst of a network of norms is a very useful way of going beyond the politics of membership when one steps beyond the confines of citizenship as legal status. It's a useful way of giving some content and specificity to the task of studying citizenship, which risks otherwise becoming excessively broad and vague when viewed purely politically or sociologically, or too narrow if it's viewed simply doctrinally. The point about the space of law approach is that it provides a useful metaphor or space to enclose the multiple contestations of normative order that are so important to understanding both the individual citizenship regimes of the new states of Southeast Europe, but most particularly the regimes as a group, and not as an isolated group, but as a group of uniquely interconnected regimes which themselves are interconnected in different ways with other regimes in the region, with those which are further afield through diasporas and emigrants, and also through the EU with also the EU member states. The interconnectedness is not just at the systemic or institutional level in the context of systems of norms themselves, but it also exists in the way that individuals and groups negotiate their way through the labyrinth of tunnels offered by these systemic or institutional connections, the choices they make at the individual and group level. The space of law idea reinforces the multiple roles of legal institutions and norms as well, and so brings the law back in a manner which goes beyond the role of citizenship law, which is limited to the rules of acquisition and loss of formal membership status. It engages equally with non-citizenship and quasi-citizenship status. It captures the role of law in relation to claims and institutions of active citizenship. It recovers something about law in relation to citizenship, which does not appear in most theories or conceptualizations, in that law is not relegated to being just to the status of being a boundary marker, or of being simply an instrument for upholding or undermining social choices made elsewhere by actors, which citizenship regimes for which types of citizens. And law is not simply a means of solving problems which arise in the international sphere, such as statelessness, persons without citizenship and refugeehood and persecution. It encompasses in that sense both the normal and the abnormal or exceptional incidents of citizenship or its absence. But of course, as with any approach, it's not perfect. There are many problems with the citizenship law as a space of law approach, not least of which is that it's not been fully worked out yet. Citizenship, which involves deciding on the boundaries of the polity, is fundamentally a community decision, a decision around which there has to be a politics. While it's correct to treat law as more than just an instrumental or normative phenomenon in that context, it's nonetheless important to be aware of the limitations of the approach. Moreover, this approach is not a complete approach to studying the citizenship regimes under review, either comparatively or in their complete European or international context. It may be that despite my problems with Europeanization, there are some phenomena, such as the influence of external norms, which would be best encompassed by other concepts, terms, or frames of reference, such as Europeanization. While legal scholars rarely engage self-consciously in Europeanization research, they do increasingly use the notion of transnational law and transnational legal processes in order to capture something of the interconnectedness of systems in a global order. And so this something could be understood as transnational law or transnational legal process research, rather than as a space of law. The point of the analysis is not overall just to produce some basic conclusions about, or simple conclusions about the citizenship regimes. It's clear to me that the success, and that's in inverted commas, of the creation and evolution of new citizenship regimes in the new states of Southeast Europe is not going to be the creation of a set of tidy boxes in which everyone is included, statelessness is eliminated, and dual citizenship is tidied up and encapsulated within legal regulations to the extent that it no longer is a disruptive element within the system. Such a view, which is, I think, rather reductionist, seems to suggest that all we should be looking for is the maturation of the relevant regimes, so that when this is achieved, there will be no more problems with these regimes in these states than there are with the average well-established European regimes. It's then just a simple matter, I'm being ironic, of coming through the messy process of state succession, instituting the correct human rights regimes to make sure that few, if any, people, such as minorities, get squeezed out, acceding to the EU as a supranational membership regime, and presumably resolving any final problems either through regional cooperation programs or private international law, both in the civil and criminal law spheres, extradition, for example. Then those states can get on with the business as usual as normal European states, where the legal regulation of statuses of citizen or non-citizen is a fundamentally benign relationship with the regulations of the neighbouring or partner states. On this so-called progressive view, dealing with any past or current aberrations is then just a question of time and of temporal adjustment. Everything will be okay after a while. Of course, there's something in this notion of progress. The stories of adjustment themselves are rather compelling and sadly tragic, and often form an important focus of research, and have done indeed for CITSE. But the story of citizenship in the former Yugoslavia still tells us something more about our European selves, which goes beyond the tragedy of violent dissolution and its aftermath, and which relates to enduring questions about the relationship between citizenship as legal status and citizenship as community bond, which do not simply disappear in so-called modern European states. The state of maturity, even if it can be achieved, is never quite as simple and all-encompassing as we would be led to believe. The reason why I think this research will carry me beyond CITSE and its time and into other areas of research, when probably for a third time I'll study Habermas and think, oh gosh, that's interesting, is that these various regimes will always be jockeying for space, claiming citizens and territories, and sometimes also disavowing them. Thank you very much.